What is it like to try to provide the services you do when there is an invisible and currently largely undetectable pandemic moving through the population?
So there's already an underlying crisis of homelessness in California, in San Francisco, and it's a crisis that it's persistent and challenging and hard to deal with on its own. When you layer on top of that the coronavirus and its potential to harm the most vulnerable among us, we're really looking at a potential catastrophe in the Bay Area. They're also more likely to experience that. They're close quarters. They're living with a lack of hygiene and sanitation at their disposal. They have all sorts of vulnerabilities that make them more likely to both contract, suffer from, and transmit the virus. GLIDE is an organization that is and always has been committed to serving the most vulnerable. So we're doing everything that we can to keep our essential services flowing. But what we're able to do is continue to serve thousands of people every day, from meals, 3 meals a day. We're providing shelter reservations, helping people get into shelter and housing. We've been providing early childhood education and support for a lot of the families in our community. We do harm reduction. So we've got a lot of services that are still going, and we're trying to manage it with a skeleton crew. We're trying to create social distancing in our lines. People are lined up for all sorts of services.
That must be so hard. It must be so difficult to articulate to somebody, I know you're really hungry. I know this is the thing you're looking forward to. You're not going to lose your place in line, but I need you to not crowd together in the way you normally do.
Absolutely. It's a challenge. It's also, if people start getting sick, they're going to need a whole range of services that we can't provide. Even when we're up and running fully, we just can't handle 20,000 homeless people who are struggling with this virus.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.